to introduce ourselves, thank you all very much for joining us. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the director of our evidence team at the Audience Agency. But much of the speaking and much of the credit, frankly, should go to my colleagues Elise and Isaac, who will say hello in a sec. We'll be talking through a bit of information that we've got about local audiences in the area, but also then moving on to a bit of a chat with you about what it might imply, what it might mean. And obviously, lots of that will be based on your more local expertise in many cases, and or your thoughts and opinions. So do please join in at all the way through. Just make a bit more of a conversation than a kind of stand and deliver thing. But there will also be a bit of time for more of a chat later on. So if anyone has any sort of access requirements, there is auto transcription available at the bottom, and I should also sort of do a sort of description of myself for the tape, so to speak. So I'm a white, blonde-haired male who cut himself shaving this morning, as you can probably see. That's me, and I'll hand over to Elise and then Isaac to do a quick hello and description as well.
Thanks, Ollie. Hi everyone, my name is Elise and I'm the researcher on the Evidence and Insights team. Yeah, I guess that's all I need to say. For the audio description, I'm a white woman with short black hair, and I'll hand over to my colleague Isaac.
And hello, yeah, I'm Isaac. I'm the research assistant within the team. I've been at the Audience Agency for 6 months, so still relatively new. And yeah, for audience description, I am a white man in my mid-20s with blonde hair.
I should also say, because Elise is in London, I'm in Sheffield, Isaac's in Manchester, but we do have a kind of local guru who I'm sure many of you know, but it's just to say a quick hi from Tessa as well.
Hi, I'm Tessa McGregor. I'm the Service and Community Manager for the Audience Agency in Scotland, and I'm based in Edinburgh. And I know some of you, and if I don't, sort of my mission is to kind of know everybody in Scotland, which is that's involved with culture. But that's, yeah, as you can imagine, that will take a few years. But yes, I've worked in various arts jobs, and sort of obviously working for the Audience Agency is just highly exciting because it's all about data and kind of geeking out on how we can get more audiences into our venues and to see our art. So yeah, and for the record, I'm a white woman with dark hair, and I'm over 40. But I'm not going to say any more than that. Thank you.
I love how the description always kind of edges into people going, do I have to confess my age? Which
I know.
I'm doing every time. But anyway,
yeah, you're not seeing what box I tick, Ollie. Thank you.
So we'll crack on. I'll start with a little intro and then hand over to our colleagues. Just very quickly, are people familiar with audience spectrum or not? I don't know if you could maybe just stick in the chat sort of yes or no, or maybe, or a bit, something, just a bit of a sense. So we're sort of, yeah, there's a maybe, there's a yes. What I don't want to do is spend ages explaining something to you that you already know, but okay, it sounds like a little bit will be useful anyway. So I'll describe it broadly, but try not to dwell on it too much. And if there are particular bits that's worth picking up more, then Alice, feel free to ask questions as we go through if we say anything that doesn't totally make sense. But Elise, can you advance to the next slide? Lovely. So this is broadly what we're going to cover, not in fact the kind of 19th century history of Glasgow, although I just thought it was rather beautiful, but we're going to be talking about essentially who's in the local area, who's attending in the local area, and then have a bit of a discussion about what that means and the implications from that, which should give us a nice clear shape to it. So if we can click again. So when we say the local area, so we've said West Central Scotland, so it's covering this whole patch, but essentially, obviously, where the vast majority of the population is Glasgow itself. So we'll be obviously focused most of the time most of the time there, but also talking a bit about Lanarkshire and Buckinghamshire. So yes, so little quick intro to audience spectrum. Audience spectrum is a segmentation model that splits the whole of the population into 10 groups based on their levels of cultural engagement. So the kinds of things that they typically do culturally and the amount they tend to do of them. So are they highly engaged, which would be the first 3 categories? Are they kind of middle engaged? The next 3 categories, are they lower engaged? The bottom 4 categories, very smooth with the clicks there, thank you. So on the higher engaged side, oh, brilliant, thanks, thanks Alice. So we've got slightly a mixture of different groups, but typically speaking, this kind of community land culture for us tends to be a bit older, more traditional, more further out. Experience seekers tend to be younger, really varied tastes, often in and around university areas. Middle engaged groups, lots of families in there, but also the home and heritage are a bit older and more rural group, but there's not so many of those in this patch. But Dauntley Dependables, a really big group that we'll come across that tends to be a bit further out, quite mainstream tastes, do a bit of culture, but not loads. And then we get to the lower engaged groups, lots of different types in the mix there. But we'll particularly be talking a lot about kaleidoscope creativity, which is a group that it's just there with the arrow, yep. And they are huge in Glasgow. They're also one of the big segments in London, as it happens. And it says quite urban concentration, lots of sort of younger people living in tower blocks, particularly of the type that are in this area. So again, we'll talk a bit more about those, but there's various different types in the mix. So rather brilliantly, someone's supposed to link to the mapping. That's Tessa, thank you. But there's more detailed mapping available there, but essentially it's based on a mixture of cultural data linked to geography, lots of sort of granularity around that, and we can then apply it to booking data, to survey data, to population data, and look at how those all compare. And that's what we're doing. And I think that probably, because you all have a bit of a sense of it already, is all I need to say for now, other than maybe to flag that there is a second tier that's relatively new that we've been adding, that we've added in. So you see there, oh, if you go back, please. So there you see in the top corner. So we've got experience seekers and lots of information about who they are and what they do, and all of those could expand out into more detail. But in the top corner there, you've also got the kind of split. So there's not just experience seekers as a whole. You've also got, the type E1 and E2 who have different characteristics. They tend to be old, they tend to be younger, etc. And the same is true across all of the segments. They all kind of split into 2 groups in different ways, and each of those has their own kind of description page as well. And we'll talk a bit about those, particularly the K2 group, which is the big subsegment in this patch. So that's just showing that this smaller group of the top tier segments that split out into a much wider range with all these different summary descriptions. And if we look down to the bottom right, kaleidoscope creativity, K2, lots of hard press singles in city tower blocks, and we're going to be meeting them at various points on the way through this morning. But I think we can advance onwards to who is the local population, which I will pass over to Elise to take us through that.
I'm on that one.
I'm sorry, is it to you, Isaac?
Yeah, it's to me, yeah, the way around. Yeah.
I'll pass it to Isaac. But yes, maybe just chip in at various points. But over to you, Isaac.
Great. So yes, as a place to start, we're going to look through, if you can go to the next slide, Elise, just to the demographics of the area, who's actually in and around Glasgow City, the kind of hotspots, and something which you may have heard already, this Scottish indices of multiple deprivation, just to get a real idea of various different metrics within the city. And as Ollie has mentioned, the audience spectrum, actually looking at some profiles, percentages in the area, as well as where they actually are on the map in terms of Glasgow versus like the surrounding more rural area. Yeah, we could go to the first slide. So this, won't come as too much of a surprise. This is just the density map of the actual area. So it's just the households by ward, which unsurprisingly Glasgow is very dark because it's very dense for the amount of households. And also on the map, which you'll see crop up a few times, is just this a 30-minute drive time sort of from the centre of Glasgow in terms of how far you'd get if you were driving 30 minutes from the centre, which just gives a kind of an idea of the size of the area. But as you can see, the Glasgow is very dark, and we have this very large area in South Lanarkshire, which is very large geographically, but obviously doesn't have many people, but will often appear as quite a large patch on the map. Great, if we can move to the next one. So starting with some comparisons of West Central Scotland versus Scotland as a whole. We just have these charts that have the outer ring of Scotland and then the inner ring, West Central Scotland. And here you can see that, at least for the top few, West Central Scotland is really quite similar when it comes to the sort of percentage of families, and also retirees is very similar to Scotland in numbers. And then the students is kind of bang on the average. But as we'll come to when we look at them a bit more, there's a lot of variation. Of course, Lanarkshire has a very different amount of students to Glasgow, which obviously has its universities. In terms of education, quite similar, but just a slightly less sort of coming from Glasgow in terms of university education is a bit lower than the average of Scotland as a whole. But the ethnic diversity is a fair bit higher than Scotland as a whole, which again, sort of almost entirely is because of Glasgow City itself. As you can see here, the groups, that there is a slightly higher black British population, but that's mostly the Asian British group, which here we just have the largest groups. Which of the biggest is the Pakistani population, and then just some wards that these are that you might know if you're in Glasgow. So it's like Southside Central, very much in the centre of the city, is the Pakistani. There's around 22% Chinese within the Asian group, which are there's obviously a lot of some overlap between the groups, but they're more like in Hillhead and Partick, and then there's a similar amount of the Indian British population, which most popular in Govan and in the actual city centre of the ward. Good, go on to the next one. So this is just what I briefly mentioned, an overview of this the Scottish indices of multiple deprivation, which England has a very similar pattern. It's just something that looks at kind of through a heat map, but it doesn't just look at income, but it looks at a lot of other metrics, from crime to kind of the actual housing available and education, and combines them all into a pattern which you can go online and explore kind of the area, so it's your area around your venue or the city itself. That's the overview. We could go to the next one, which just zooms in. So unsurprisingly, there's quite a lot of deprivation in different parts of Glasgow City, in sort of especially around the centre and to the east of the city. These areas are quite high on across kind of different deprivation ranks. But to the right, just put an area like North Kelvin, which is part of that blue patch you see in the sort of northwest of the city, that starts to become a kind of much less deprived area. Though of course that's not the only part of the city, there are other parts of the city, but where we see, as we'll see, quite a lot of students and retirees, things. If we could go to the next one. And just zooming into above the city, some of the other areas that have sort of a fairly large amount of population, Eastern Bartonshire, which I'm sure you'll know in the area is quite a fairly wealthy local authority, just above the city, but certainly even more so than Western Bartonshire. But like any local authority area, there are areas within their patches of that are quite a lot more deprived, like Lennox Town is the example within Eastern Berkshire, where you'll see kind of a red patch that is lower on especially income and employment, but then isn't as low on something like housing. So there's a real mix depending. If you go on to the next one, and then just to show you below Glasgow City, just to include the whole geographical area. Obviously, the very large Lanarkshire surrounding the city is mostly not so deprived, really. It's mostly like blues and light blues for fairly high on a lot of the indices. But of course, there is some areas like Douglas is the one that I've got there on the right, that patch of very dark red, which is obviously a small population, but has quite high deprivation, is kind of a 1 on a lot of the areas. So like most places, a real patchwork of deprivation. But I do recommend going online, having a look on the website. It's really interesting. Just you can look at every single ward and what their amounts are. Great, we could move on. So on to the actual spectrum profile. So I guess the kind of key thing to mention is that this is really quite a lower engaged area in terms of the lower engaged segments in the blue here. They do make up about 52% of the population. And especially you'll see this very large bar above Kaleidoscope Creativity, especially compared to Scotland and the UK that we have on here, is very represented. These are the as kind of Ollie mentioned, especially in ours, it's this like hard-pressed urban residents, more interested in sort of local community arts. But we also have a fairly large segment, the experience seekers, compared to Scotland and the UK as well, which are a more highly engaged group with quite an eclectic taste of different arts. And within that, as we'll go on to the split within, is kind of a mix of students and some, but also midlife professionals. But we see them as quite highly engaged, and you'll see later on are really quite highly represented in various different art forms and art bookings. Yeah. If we could move on to the next one. So as Ollie briefly mentioned, we've split the segments because we found there's a lot more information we get from looking at both of them. So especially in this area, there is really quite an imbalance between some of the sub-segments. So especially, as we say, this really large Kaleidoscope Creativity segment is really almost entirely made up by this K2 segment of the population, which you can see sort of a full explanation of. There is these kind of hard-pressed singles and the city tower blocks, which I'm sure you'll have sort of seen around Glasgow. So that's by far the biggest segment. But we also have, as I say, the experience seekers are also in there. And they're a bit more of a mix, so 5% of more of the kind of studenty section of that population, which are quite highly engaged. But the biggest section within that is these midlife professionals are living sort of around, usually within Glasgow. And then, as I'll briefly show you in the map, these dormitory dependables, which are the more kind of suburbanite people, that are more medium engaged. So just kind of for reference, this is actually within each local authority, what you actually find the highest are, starting kind of with Glasgow is, as you'd expect, as we said, is the kind of high experience seekers Kaleidoscope Creativity, which we have, of course, where the Black and Asian British population is, and the student population. And just interested to note a couple of these that are extremely high for the country. So excluding London and the south, It's quite interesting that Glasgow is the 5th highest for metroculturals. This is this group that's by far the highest sort of engaged of any group, of any segment. These people that are really go to a lot of different arts and a really varied grouping. That Glasgow, as well as having quite a lot of low engaged people, has this small core of very highly engaged residents, which are very interested in different arts. But it's of course also 7th highest for kaleidoscope creativity outside of London, where we see some similarities. And even higher, Western Bartonshire is actually the 4th highest local authority in all of the UK, outside of London, for this kaleidoscope creativity group. And yeah, across the other ones we see, there's obviously Eastern Bartonshire is kind of higher retirees, and then there's more families in North Lanarkshire. And just to kind of reference, we're looking at around 700,000 people, of which about half or more of that is in Glasgow City, and then sort of decreasing in amounts the further we get away. But North Lanarkshire and South Lanarkshire have got also quite a high population, and then smaller in the Dunbartonshire areas. Great, we can go to the next one. So moving on for a change to some actual mapping of the area. So we've again this is all based on different wards. Just again a kind of a heat map, but in this we're just mapping what the top quartile of the wards that actually have these particular, in this case, sort of family groups, and then we'll go on to some others. So the dark coloured wards are where say the family groups live, and then the lighter coloured, the kind of second highest quartile for this particular group. So families, they're a bit more widespread. You can see sort of surrounding Glasgow, above Glasgow, kind of heading towards Eastern Bartonshire, there's quite a high proportion of families, but also sort of smattered around, heading more towards I think what was just the edge of Lanarkshire, and there's just a list there which you can sort of have a look up to see what the highest wards are, which is Cambuslang East is the highest for families. Yeah, if we can move on to the next one, which we've kind of gone the most in depth into the Asian British residents, which they, as you maybe know from living in Glasgow, they're kind of in kind of a band around above and below the river, just sort of near to the centre of Glasgow, in various different wards, of which the top are Pollokshields and Southside Central, and then the actual Anderson sort of city ward are the highest, with Pollokshields finished as 27%, but that's a very Pakistani British sort of ward, with only 1 in 10 Indian, whereas that shifts slightly when you go to Southside Central, and then the Anderson, the sort of city York Hill ward is the one that is by far the highest for the Chinese portion of the Asian population. But kind of as we mentioned, so this is the kind of one metric that's quite different to Scotland as a whole in terms of the concentrations. But as you'd expect, it's pretty heavy around Glasgow. Great, we can go on to the next one. And another thing we've mapped, again, unsurprisingly, the student population, although it's interesting that it's still quite heavily concentrated as you go up into kind of Eastern Bartonshire, where I guess not all the students are living sort of close to universities. I guess it's from my experience, this is the later year students that move sort of just a bit out of the city and then travel into the city. But they're also most likely in the centre, I guess, where the halls and things are in the city, York Hill, and also Hillhead, all quite concentrated around this central Glasgow area, sort of just above where the Asian populations are most concentrated. Next one. We also map those in professional occupations is another metric we looked at, which is just sort of becoming slightly different. We do have this centre of the city sort of top quartile wards quite near to where the students and other kind of residents live, but then also going above into the kind of wealthier Eastern Bartonshire local authority. It's also quite high in like Bearsden, which comes up a few times. It's also quite high for professionals, and even in this sort of big rural area in South Lanarkshire, where I guess it's a lot more rural, but quite a lot of professionals living, I guess, in sort of much lower concentrations. We can go on to the next one. And bit of a similar picture, obviously some overlap with university educated groups, which again have some in the centre, but then also going up into Bearsden North, in heading towards sort of east of Bartonshire, but still this quite large contingent in the sort of centre or to the left of the centre of Glasgow around Victoria Park. We also see quite high concentrations of university educated. And then retirees is a bit of a different picture. I suppose unsurprisingly, they're not really around Glasgow proper and the centre. The highest concentrations, they're much more in and contributing to the wealthier area of Eastern Bartonshire, which is where we see really quite high concentrations of sort of not too far from Glasgow, but concentrated again around this Bearsden North and South, which has, as we mentioned, some of the professional, as Elise mentioned, professional occupations, but really even more concentrated, and then similar to the professionals, where you actually get the large area with less people of Lanarkshire below, coming up as quite high. I guess in these sort of smatterings of lower concentrations, but retirees that live more rural and then travel into the centre of Glasgow. So, and then finally, we, as well as sort of looking at charts of the segments, we are also able to look at like a dominant segment within each particular ward. We get these kind of nice coloured maps, which shows for a particular ward what is actually the dominant segment in the population, and we'll later come to what's the dominant segment for who's actually booking. But this is just looking for per ward, and we see this kind of quite large patch in the rural area of below in Lanarkshire, which is the more families, what we call the frontline families of quite low engaged semi-urban renting. But then if we can look into, we can zoom in on the next slide, Elise. Just really looking at the area of Glasgow where a lot of the people are. We see a lot of this pink is the kaleidoscope creativity that we've mentioned quite a lot, which unsurprisingly is really kind of around the actual centre, sort of below where the Glasgow sign is, which to the west of the city, we have this patch of experience seekers that we mentioned, which are the quite highly engaged. Obviously, unsurprisingly, that matches quite where the students are and more the professionals, and also the Asian population. But we also have above Glasgow, which kind of matches the other maps, these dormitory dependables are in quite dominant in a lot of the wards. Above the city, you get these quite large brown patches on the map, that unsurprisingly, these are the kind of suburban sort of middle engaged segment, with kind of more mainstream tastes, which will sort of travel into the city, but they're really above Glasgow in this kind of wealthier area. It's quite interesting to notice.
So just jump in.
Yeah.
Things. If you go back to the mapping, maybe if you go back one more, Elise. So just a couple of things to note really is that we've talked about there's loads of this Glasgow creativity group. The highest engaged group that's present in large numbers is experience seekers. Both of those are quite price sensitive. And so they're both probably going to be a bit more reluctant to spend larger amounts. So some of those areas of dormitory pendables and community land culture buffs might be your stronger prospects for particularly higher value ticketed stuff. So worth noting those. The other thing which I think it's particular to Scotland because the ward sizes are bigger, if I'm wrong, that we have this, it's not misleading because it's true, but it's maybe sort of could give you the wrong impression, where we see this big concentration of frontline families down in South Lanarkshire, but really what's happening there is that in the rural areas, we'd be getting the other groups, but then in pockets, there's kind of pockets of concentration of frontline families that because we're talking about quite a big patch, that all ends up getting coloured that way, but actually it's really very sort of speckled, that particular group. So just maybe just to note that in terms of context, but yeah, so that appears to be the overall shape of it. And we do have those two slightly intriguing pockets of community land culture buffs out to the northeast and southeast as well, which is really worth.
Yeah, they're interesting. They stand out there, yeah.
Anyway, sorry, that's enough of me interrupting.
And if we can just go on to the final, the ward list, just kind of for reference for people, that if you want to look at a particular ward, we've just kind of got the list of the where the highest concentrations of each of these are. So as we mentioned, they're kind of quite surprisingly high metroculturals are actually like 32% of the ward in Partick East and Kelvindale, and also quite high in Hillhead around in the centre. But then we also have these experience seekers, again, the ward that has both the kind of the Asian population and also students and everything, which are actually 79% of one of the wards. And it's just interesting to have a look through if there's any sort of near any of your venue and see the kind of percentages which get quite high for some of the wards. Especially interesting to look at some of the higher engaged ones where they're like community and culture buffs and some of the ones that are a bit rarer. But as we mentioned, Bearsden has really quite high concentrations of that, where they're making like two-thirds of the ward or all of this one segment. Great, I think that's pretty much everything for me on the actually who's in the area and the population. And I will pass over to my colleague Elise, which is who's going to go into who the actual local audience is in terms of who people will be actually attending your venues as well.
That's before we do that.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Ollie.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just to check that if anyone had any questions or comments or things they wanted to clarify on that first bit, and or comments in terms of what you're seeing in terms of your own perceptions of the local area before we move on to the actual attending bit. So if anyone has anything they want to either check or remark on, feel free. Now's your moment.
Or if you want your moment later, save it up for later.
You can have as many moments as you want, but
we've still got to remember it's only 11:15 in the morning, you know. So yeah.
So is it all sort of clear so far, everyone?
Great.
Yeah, lovely. In which case, I shall get out again and hand over to Elise. But yes, do feel free to pop stuff in the chat or ask any questions on the way through as you want to.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, and do stop us at any point if there's anything that's unclear or if you want to add in extra insights. Yes, so we have looked at the local population, So information that we have access to based on the census data and that sort of stuff, the whole population. Now we want to look also, because at the audience agency we have access to quite a lot of Booker data and data through Audience Finder, who the local audience is. And this is based on, yes, our Audience Finder dataset, which aggregates Booker data from lots of different organizations. Some of you might be contributing data to this, some of you might not. And we're going to look at this local audience. What is their behavior? How's it been evolving through time? And going to look at more maps, more audience spectrum as well. So just to get us started, this is a little overview of what we have in the Audience Finder ticketing database. And this, we're going to look at West Central Scotland, anyone who lives in there, whether they attend within West Central or outside, we're going to take them into consideration. And the tables there on the right are looking at different measures that we have in terms of bookers is just a single household that has made a booking. Booking is what they've done, and then the tickets is the number of tickets, and the income is obviously the amount of money that they spent. And that's all gets aggregated. And we're looking at the financial year 2016-17 compared to 2019-20, and the change between the two, between those this time. And what we're seeing in West Central Scotland compared to Scotland below is that all the different measures broadly went down slightly. In comparison, Scotland has stayed quite level, going up a little bit in income. So we're seeing right off the bat that there is a decrease in the local audience, in their engagement in general. And on the left there is just to mention briefly the local venues that are included in this Audience Finder ticketing database. So you have places like CTA, is contributing Glasgow Live. It's worth noting that all of these are in Glasgow except for the Cumbernauld Theatre, which is in North Lanarkshire, I believe. Yeah, so this is just our overview of the area and of what we have. And please right to mention that most of this increase that we see in Scotland overall seems to be in West Central Scotland, in Central Scotland rather than any of the other places. Now looking at audience spectrum again, and looking at different art forms within this data set that we have. And this is across this 4-year period that is pre-pandemic. And what we're seeing is, and this is quite typical when looking at most arts audiences, is, as you would expect, our higher engaged segments get overrepresented in the data set and the lower engaged segments get underrepresented. So what you're seeing is, although you have 22% kaleidoscope creativities in your area, in reality, only 4 or 5% actually go to arts events and book tickets. And this is 4% for performing arts tickets and 5% for museums and heritage. So we want to give a little difference because we know that the profile can vary quite a lot depending on art form. So we can see there you have a lot more dormitory dependables booking for museums and heritage, whereas for performing arts, experience seekers is the highest segment engaging. And a few key differences by art forms. Kaleidoscope creativity, although they are quite lowly engaged, the art form they're highest for is children and family shows, actually. So that's worth bearing in mind. And experience seekers, they're quite high. They're even higher for film and cinema. They go up to 40%. And plays and drama and theatre, they go up to 29%. Dormitory dependables, we're seeing they're quite high for museum and heritage. They're also high for children and family shows. And Up Art Street, which is still quite a high segment in your local area. It's the 3rd highest. They are higher for performing arts and particularly high for music as well. This includes free tickets, Maxi. this is all tickets issued, so it includes fully paid tickets, it includes comps, it includes free ticketed experiences. But it's worth pointing out this only includes ticketed experiences. So we're missing out on quite a lot of free museums or libraries or free outdoor arts that would not have a way to be ticketed. And excuse me, this is something we capture more in with our survey data. Unfortunately, we didn't quite have enough for this event, enough data to really bring out the survey data into this. Is there a bias here due to the venues reporting? I'm not sure if you mean reporting in the way of, there's definitely a bias in terms of we can only present data that is part of our data pool. So we can only include we have the bias of the venues that are part of our data set. But these venues, their box office data is sort of automatically sort of streamed to us. So there isn't a bias in terms of whether the venues themselves do any reporting or not. If that answers the question. Yeah, Tessa, I can see you, both of you wanted to say something.
Oh, no, no, it's just to answer Maxine's question as well. Is this only paid tickets, or does it include free ticketed experiences? So it can include free ticketed experience. So it's anything that's coming through from your box office feed into the audience finder data set. So and free tickets are identified within that makeup. So
yes, Lee?
The thing that I was just going to flag is that because we're looking at the profile of people living in the area attending, the potential range of venues could be any venue that's within Audience Finder. So it's not just the local ones. But yes, clearly, different local venues would make a particular difference. But as I saw, I think a couple of slides back, there are quite a few different local venues, so it's not down to one or two.
Yeah, we're quite lucky in this area to have quite a lot of contributing venues, but it's good to remember that this is local people attending anywhere in the country, although there is a bias towards attending local venues. But yeah, there's a little bit later at local venues, but for now we're just looking at local people attending anywhere in the country. But thanks for bringing questions. Yeah, always good when we can clarify things. So this is the general profile. We're seeing a lot of these higher engaged segments. Now we wanted to look at how these evolve over time. So this is an index. So if you take whichever number we're attending in 2016-17, if you take that as 100, how does it evolve over time? Does it go up or down? So another way to think about it is that 105 line is like a 5% increase, and the 95 is like a 5% decrease, is another way to think about it. So how are all the different segments evolving? And we've kind of grayed out that box between 5% and increase and decrease, just to kind of think in terms of we're not going to focus too hard on any small increases or decreases, because there could be so many different contributing factors, and it wouldn't be necessarily conclusive. However, we do have a few segments above and below that threshold. So in terms of increasing segments, we have our Kaleidoscope Creativity, which we know is the largest in the area. So although the audience, as we said at the beginning, the audience overall numbers are decreasing, Kaleidoscope Creativity as a proportion of the overall profile are actually increasing. And so are trips and treats. So we're seeing family groups, lower middle income groups are not increasing by a huge amount, but are at least staying level. Other family groups like front-time families are also staying relatively level. And in terms of decreasing groups, we have older and lower income groups such as home and heritage, supported communities up our street. We are seeing a little bit of a pattern here in terms of which groups might grow in the future and which groups might not, or less. This is, of course, all pre-pandemic, but it does show a good indication of trends. And then, yeah, sorry, kaleidoscope creativity, the one that we were talking about earlier, is over here. Now going back to our mapping of the audience spectrum segments, and again, to clarify, this is showing the dominant segment in every ward. So it doesn't mean that there's none of the other segments, it's just whichever has the highest proportion. This was the picture for the population. So this is counting all households, which is the most prominent. But now if we look at bookers, we see that it's quite a changed picture. So this is dominant segment in bookers. It should say bookers here, not households. But this, so we're seeing that the dormitory dependables, although they weren't, they were only dominant in a few pockets over here, they're really taking over. And that is quite a typical picture because they're just quite highly engaged segments. And as their name suggests, they're quite dependable as an audience, as in they will attend a lot of things. And that shift here, we're seeing the experience seekers and kaleidoscope creativities in inner Glasgow pockets are holding their own. They're really staying, they're the most dominant in the population and they stay dominant in the bookers. But all around these other pockets have, we really see the dormitory dependables as being the most highly engaged. This is just a view to see which ones are actually changing. We've grayed out the areas that don't change, and all of these that still have color are the ones that do change. And the change happens like this. So we're seeing quite clearly all of these kaleidoscope creativity areas, especially to get taken over by dormitory dependables and some community and culture buffs and trips and treats, and some experience seekers as well. So this is essentially showing you where there are these pockets of kaleidoscope creativity that, and then who actually gets to engage. Then we are going to look at a few more maps and charts looking at the local audiences, and looking a bit more in detail at where exactly, because I was mentioning that there, at the moment we just saw they could be going anywhere in the UK, but we wanted to show you a little bit more about where they are actually attending, how much of it is to local venues, for example. And essentially this is the picture we're seeing. So just to explain a little bit, all these different colors and bars, we're looking at bookers in all of West Central Scotland, and then from different local authorities, and whether they attend in green to venues in Glasgow, in grey to venues in North Lanarkshire. And I could have included the other local authorities, but there are no venues, well, we don't have venues in our data set in there, so that's why there's these green and grey essentially represent all of West Central Scotland. And then also in orange, quite interestingly, venues in Edinburgh, and then in blue, the rest of Scotland. So essentially, if you stack up the bar all the way to the blue line, that is all of Scotland. And then in pink above, rest of the UK. So we can see it's very concentrated, obviously in Scotland. Everywhere, the majority of people are attending in Glasgow, if not in all of West Central Scotland. So it's quite a local audience. Your local audience is staying quite local and staying quite loyal to local venues. And it's worth mentioning this is in terms of number of tickets. So this is volume of tickets, the percentages. But we're seeing that bar with Edinburgh City has quite a lot of variation from place to place, and is quite large, 70% overall. And we're seeing for North and South Lanarkshire, it goes up to 21 and 25%, and that makes sense in a way because those are the two local authorities that are closest geographically to Edinburgh. And we're seeing for Glasgow City itself, 76% of tickets are sold to local venues. So it is the most local. And North Lanarkshire, which is the local authority that has this other venue, it is 50%. So it's like a slightly high proportion, but they are still mostly going to all these other venues that are in Glasgow, which kind of makes sense because it's, in terms of volume, there are more of them. So proportionally, it would make sense. So that's sort of geographically how it splits. Now, if we look at bookers not by local authority, but by time of year that they are booking for, this is the picture. So we have, again, overall 72% booking in West Central Scotland. This goes down in the summer, and people start booking a lot more outside of West Central Scotland, and especially in Edinburgh. And I'm sure it's evident to all of us that that is because of the Fringe and International Festival, all the festivals happening in Edinburgh. But it's quite neat to see it actually spelled out like this and to see the actual percentage. Essentially, it's almost on par, 43% locally and then 41% to Edinburgh. So essentially you're having almost as many bookings to Edinburgh from your local people as to your venues. And then if we split this again by art form, this is the picture. So again, overall 72% booking locally, and this goes up to 90% for film. Makes sense, people rarely travel quite far for cinema. It's probable that the final 10% is people going on holiday and just having the opportunity to go watch film. Dance and plays are the two art forms where people will travel the furthest afield for. So a third of bookings to dance are for Edinburgh, and you might have more insight than us into why that is. And plays and drama, especially 18%, are actually going outside of Scotland and booking out in the rest of the UK. And Christmas, again, is quite high for local bookings because people tend to go see pantomimes and Christmas shows locally. Hopefully this gives you a bit more of an insight into where people are booking and for what reasons they might do that and how it might vary through time. So now we're going to look at a few more maps of where these audiences are. And we're back at our map of West Central Scotland with our drive time in purple here, a half an hour drive from Glasgow, just to give you context. And this is looking at the penetration of bookers in households. So which percentage of the households in that ward have booked at least once? And we're seeing it quite concentrated in Glasgow, and especially in the west of Glasgow. That quite wealthy area we were seeing earlier on the North Bank, and then that pocket in the sort of, if I understand correctly, the sort of post-industrial area. And also Cumbernauld in the top right corner has a bit of a darker patch. And this goes up to 64%, you can see in the legend. So it means that at most 64% of households in a given area, in a given ward, have booked at least once in our data set, in our 16 data set. That was the penetration in terms of actual raw numbers. That translates to up to 9,000 bookers in those darkest areas. Sorry, had to sneeze, it's gone. Okay, and we see again this northwest wealthy area really coming out strong in terms of bookings, which kind of checks out. People with more disposable income are more likely to take part. So this is just bookers from the local area booking anywhere. But if we look at just bookers booking through our local organizations that we have access to, this is the picture. So still it's even more concentrated to these few areas in the northwest. And it's still quite high, 54% at most. So again, we're seeing that picture that audiences do stay quite local in this area. And just for the record here, in terms of actual numbers, all of these slides will be available after the talk for you to look back on. So yeah, feel free to go back and have a closer look. Now, this is the picture for local areas, local audiences and local venues, but we wanted to look at what do we know about non-local audiences in the local area. So people from outside West Central who come in, and people who are local who go outside. So this is again looking at audience spectrum because it gives us quite a good overview. We're seeing that our local bookers who go out, they tend to be more the experience seekers. It kind of makes sense in the name. They seek out new experiences. They'll be more likely to go further afield. Whereas people from outside the area coming in, we have a lot of community land cultivars and home and heritage. Home and heritage, as the name suggests, tend to be more into heritage activities, and community land cultivars quite highly engage a lot of disposable income. Alex says, it's striking to me that there's high concentration in the higher experience seeker area north of Clyde. Yes, that's very true. Thank you for pointing that out. And being on the ground, you might all have more insights as well as to where those pockets are and why. So this is the view of looking at people coming in versus people going out, which is quite interesting. Interestingly, a lot more of the lower engaged segments in people going out, which makes sense because there are quite a lot of those people in the base population in your area. Let's skip through that. And in terms of volume of tickets, this movement of out versus in, local people who visit places outside of the area, that volume of tickets goes way up in the summer, as we saw earlier, because of the Fringe, because of things happening in Edinburgh. And in terms of non-local people coming in, there's a spike in the winter, possibly because of Christmas shows. But if any of you have additional insight to why that might be, feel free to drop it in the chat or even just come unmute yourself and feel free to contribute. But broadly speaking, larger volume of tickets going in than leaving, but that might also just be a product of a larger population outside of the area. So we're seeing local people engage more and engage more outside of the area in the summer. This is sort of just the net flow. Kind of give an overview that there's a net decrease, well, a net flow out in the summer, whereas there's a net flow in the rest of the time. So although the audience stays quite local, it's not to say that people from outside the area don't contribute to the local, to the audience. Sarah says it would be interesting to see if that would be the same for the commercial ATP theatres. It would be interesting. Higher prices and more traditional art forms than say the CCA. Yes, it definitely would be. ATG do not contribute data to Audience Finder. And yeah, there's not much we can do about that. We would also like to see, Tessa, do you want to?
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, they even kind of emphasised that recently because we've been at them for years actually to share their data, but I think they just clarified their position to say that they would not share data with us because of the commercial aspect of what they do. We did try and siphon off Scotland in that, you know, there's not as many ATG venues up here, and could it be considered as a, you know, they definitely won't do it in England and Wales, but could they do it in Scotland for the 3 venues that they have? But that has gone nowhere as we speak, but you know, we will continue and try. So but yes, that's just the state of play.
it just seems a shame, sort of the two significant, like, well, three significant venues with massive audiences to, yes. I think that adding that data into these data sets would make, because I know the audience is very different to what we experience at the CCA, and I just, absolutely. You know, people are having to choose leisure activities. If they're choosing a £75 theatre ticket, they may not then go elsewhere. So it's just a wee shame.
It is a real, I mean, honestly, because obviously the ATG programme in terms of sort of the cultural panoply is sort of it would be really interesting to see the mix in the data set. But yeah, I mean, do you know anybody over there? Still that we can, I mean, honestly, we sort of cherry picked our people to try and persuade over time. Yeah.
Which is I think I missed it on the list, but does the exhibition centre contribute data?
No, it doesn't, but doesn't mean to say that it couldn't or wouldn't. So yeah, again, because it's probably out with the kind of traditional cultural kind of selection of venues and companies.
And I guess if they're not funded by Creative Scotland, they maybe need to do less of this reporting.
But you know, we don't just work with Creative Scotland venues. I mean, we're always at pains to sort of say that you know, for instance, the national companies aren't funded by Creative Scotland, but they get, you know, direct government funding, but we do work with them. So yeah, there are outside, you know, out with CS funded organisations that we do work with. So yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one, Sarah. I hadn't even sort of entered my realm really. So yeah, it could be worth looking into actually.
They do a lot of theatre now, so it just and like Comic-Con and stuff like that. So they've got quite a wide variety of art forms. It could be quite interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up. What was I going to say? Yeah, I'm pleased you mentioned the sort of people having to choose between costs of different tickets. We're going to talk a little bit more, not based on the ticketing data set, but a little bit more about insights we can give you, even if we're missing some venues, into audience behavior and how that might be changing, because we're doing some monitoring of that on a nationwide basis. So a little bit more on that later. Who will hopefully bring a few more insights. But just to go back to the non-local audiences, this is the net flow in and out. And in terms of seeing where those non-local audiences are mostly from, this is the picture, which is again showing you the penetration of bookers to local organizations only. And we're seeing really a bit more of concentration around the Northwest, going into Argyll. A few pockets here between Edinburgh and Glasgow in that West Lothian area, and going towards Queensberry, and a few pockets around Ayrshire as well, along the coast, possibly because of this good transport link. Again, these areas at the top look big. They're probably just very big wards rather than having high populations. This is penetration, so it's a percentage regardless of size of the population. So this picture, looking at actual numbers of bookers, looks like this. So we're seeing Edinburgh being a little bit in a darker color here, around Stirling, again around Ayrshire and the coast. This is a bit more of an insight into where those audiences from further afield might come from, local audience, local venues. Now, just finally, some more insights we can bring in outside of the ticketing data set. We have a few more tricks up our sleeve, so to speak. And we're going to talk a little bit about the cultural participation monitor, which is nationally representative survey. So it's meant to represent views of the population. And it's longitudinal, which means that we have carried it over several years actually at this point, to monitor attitudes of people towards cultural attendance. And this right here is just showing you one of the questions that we ask, which is how if there was something you wanted to view right now, what would be your response? Would you be happy to attend straight away? Would you consider attending, but with some reservations because of COVID safety? Would you be not comfortable until there's a significant reduction in the risk, or not comfortable until the virus is completely eradicated, or plainly just not interested in cultural events in general, which happens. And this is from our latest wave of data, which was collected. So this is people who were asked the question in September of this year. And this is based, just for the record, on a sample size of about 3,500 people. The gray bar is just the results overall. Just over half say that they're happy to attend right now. This has gone massively up from even just earlier this year. It was around a third still, or over a third. And now we're just over half. So we've seen that people are just more inclined to attend arts and culture. And this goes up for students and families, and goes down for retirees, and in general for older people. And in terms of considering, but with reservations, you have more of these retirees, and again, a lot more retirees for people just not interested. So it's just a little something to keep in mind, to give you a little further insight into, if you know that your audience is of a particular type, how might they be feeling right now? Because we've presented to you data from pre-COVID. And so we just wanted to bring in a little bit more of the current attitudes and current trends. All of this, there's a lot more information about the Culture Participation Monitor insights available on our website. But a few more insights that are just relevant to, thanks Tessa for the link. More insights relevant to today's session that I thought might be interesting to you in terms of actual attendance, either in person to arts or heritage activities, or online arts and heritage activities, or doing creative activities in their spare time, like creative hobbies, that sort of stuff. These are the numbers. So again, from our latest wave from September, overall we're in the 90s for in-person art and heritage activities done in the last 12 months. And this goes up again for families and students. And we've not put it on the bar, it goes down for retirees. We wanted to bring in Kaleidoscope Creativity because they're so high in the area. And they are kind of broadly on par in terms of in-person, but as we mentioned at the start, they're higher engaged for online activities and slightly higher for creative hobbies. But really, younger people are the most engaged online, and we've seen them that they tend to take part in creative activities a lot more as well. And we mentioned a bit earlier about the cost of living rising and affecting people and affecting what they feel like they can do. We asked about the cost of living crisis in our latest wave, and people were in general overwhelmingly saying they are worried about the cost of living crisis for themselves, for their household. And this was higher again for families and students, and retirees seem to be less worried in general. And in terms of, we were asking them whether they would tend to do fewer paid for activities or stay closer to home, which is on par overall, but we're seeing families say that they they're some of the highest engaged, and yet now they're saying that they're worried and they will do fewer things and stay closer to home. So that is just something that might raise some alarm bells, but in general, we just want to keep in mind and keep monitoring, because that might have an influence in the actual makeup of your audiences. If they were the ones who, throughout the pandemic, we've seen they stayed some of the most engaged in arts and culture, and if now they're saying that they're going to reduce spend and reduce frequency, that's definitely something that we're going to keep an eye on. There's a lot more insights about this, about the cost of living and how that affects people's behaviors, that we recently did a presentation on, and there should be a lot more on our website soon. So keep an eye out if this is something that would be helpful to you, these sort of insights. And a final bit of insight from a different project we did, where we looked at the recovery, the change in tickets and income sales pre and post COVID, to kind of see what proportion of the venues were quote unquote back to normal or doing better than pre-pandemic or not. And just to explain the slightly fiddly graph on the left, what we're seeing is that venues, their income, if they increased by only 10%, it was about just under 40% of venues. So just over a little bit over a third of venues have their income increasing 10%, and in contrast, 38%, so a broadly similar proportion, decreasing 10%. And 22% of venues had their income increase by a third, and only 13% had their income increasing by half. And in contrast, 17% had their income decreasing by a third and 9% decreasing by half. This is a change pre and post pandemic. Now, of course, this is just overall on a representative sample that we selected. This, of course, hides a lot of variation and real-term changes. And this is income that doesn't account for inflation. So an income increasing by 10% might actually not be a real-term increase in actual terms. This is just a small further insight into some more projects that we're doing to monitor how things are changing post-pandemic or within pandemic, depending on how you're viewing the current situation. And finally, a few more snippets from the Culture Participation Monitor. In terms of our audience spectrum groups, our community-led culture buffs are more likely to think it's time to just accept the risk of COVID and go back to quote-unquote normal living, whereas some of the older groups were slightly more likely to say that we should still do everything we can to minimize COVID risks. And dormitory dependables and trips and treats more likely to be happy to attend. That first question that we looked at in terms of how ready they are to go back to in-person stuff. And home and heritage are more reluctant to attend. They kind of map to being an older group with more retirees in them. Young people, more likely families, more likely people who were previously highly engaged, they have stayed, more likely to attend. And people who self-identify as having disabilities were less likely. And in terms of, this is just overall, Scotland is mostly in line with the national average in terms of engagement, but they are a bit more cautious about COVID. Respondents from Scotland, they do have slightly higher willingness to attend, but not massively, and have done slightly less online. So that's sort of the broad picture that what we can bring you in terms of how things have evolved in recent years and what we're seeing sort of on the ground, so to speak, at the moment. If anyone has any questions on this, now would be a good time, or otherwise, Ollie, if you wanted to add any further comments before I hand over to you for implications.
Not from me at this stage, I think. I mean, I think when we get to the Q&A bit, and possibly when it's not being recorded, because people might feel happier sharing, just add some thoughts about how people are seeing their own ticket sales relative to pre-COVID, and whether they recognise their own situation in those kind of figures you mentioned there in terms of volatility. But yeah, I think other than that, do as ever pop any questions in the chat. Or Tessa, go on.
No, I was just going to say, obviously on the slide it says that you know, Scotland does seem more cautious about COVID, and I suppose I've mentioned this in kind of recent presentations as well, that I think it was generally because our government were more careful about.
Yes, yeah, of course.
Yeah, I know it's like I'm like a broken record, but I think that slight reticence is carried on, so we are more careful and more conscious, and yeah, we didn't have
definitely.
Yeah, so just to add that, I mean, we sort of know that in the room really, but yeah.
I think we see something similar in Wales as well, where, you know,
yes,
greater cautiousness results in sort of like maybe a quicker response, a harder response, more frequent, more intense lockdowns, and a slower recovery.
Yes. Yeah.
The attitudes of the different safety measures put in place and politics.
Yeah, I think it was just we're doing what we were told more, maybe.
It had an influence on people's,
I did, when I was doing a little bit of sort of random scouting around for background information, I saw a really striking map from I think it's like March 2021, and it was sort of just pre another sort of Scottish lockdown, I think. But it was showing the map of COVID cases in Glasgow, and a really sharp north-south divide either side of the Clyde, which is really frightening. Anyway, let's have a bit of a look at what the implications of all this might be, at least from our perspective, and then please do feed in your own thoughts, and we sort of unpick it a little bit together. So, I mean, in a way, this is, you know, a bit of a general statement. It's a bit like, you know, tourist guides that go, so-and-so is a land of contrasts. It is true to say there's lots of variety within the area, both in terms of urban-rural split, which we talked about, but obviously very much that kind of wedge heading out northwest, and those pockets next to the Clyde with all the experience seekers, and then lots of the rest of the city. You know, big differences both in demographics, but also we've seen also in attendance, and that playing through. We're seeing those experience seekers being really quite highly engaged, even relative to other engaged groups that we might expect to have come through from some of those further north areas. Notably, a really huge, yes, lower engaged groups, but particularly Kaleidoscope Creativity. And that group, although you would always expect lower engaged groups to be less engaged by definition, if you like, but I would say they're particularly lower engaged in this particular instance, particularly that Kaleidoscope Creativity. You know, if we're talking 20-odd percent, you know, 20-odd percent of the population, only 4 or 5% of attenders. It's not like they're half represented. It's like, you know, way down to like a quarter or a fifth. That strikes me as quite striking. And particularly if we're not seeing some of those other groups crowding in, it really is sort of, you know, the opportunity potentially is there in terms of proportion of the mix, and it's maybe not happening. We could, you know, speculate that it could be that there's a sufficiently large population, you know, within these groups that there's a critical mass that can find other things to do. You see what I mean? So, but you would sometimes see in other places that if you have a high enough critical mass, then there's the opportunity to cater for that group more effectively through arts and cultural organisations. So maybe that's not happening as fully, and/or there's kind of, you know, greater entrenchment of disadvantage maybe in certain areas. But but it feels like that's quite a notable bit of the picture. It's about this really large group. Sort of interesting that for, bearing in mind it's a consistent group of organisations, that we are seeing a relative drop in ticket sales. That would be, it's across those years. I mean, it's a not insignificant dip. But I mean, clearly that's not all the venues. It's not all the most commercial venues, but there's something maybe just to keep an eye on, and maybe compare to the trends within your own organisations to see whether, are you individually bucking that. But also worth noting that some of those older and lower income groups have been drifting away a little bit, but not actually the Glasgow creativity. So there does seem to be a slight growth there. Family groups we see growing in lots of different places. It's one of those areas where there's a kind of emerging trend of the increasing importance of family audiences. Families can be a key way in terms of engaging some of the lower engaged groups as well. So it sort of feels like that might be an area worth doubling down. So yes, of course, it's a very local audience, and people do always gravitate towards the big centres, and we are seeing that. But notable, there's this big jump towards Edinburgh in the summer. Of course, there's obvious drivers for that, but it is worth noting that the lower engaged an audience group is, the less inclined it tends to be to travel. So if we're seeing a big shift in terms of travelling in that period, it suggests that that's probably one of the things that is diluting the relative engagement of low engaged groups, because low engaged groups probably won't be travelling quite so much for that. And that could mean that there's therefore an opportunity to cater more to some of those Glasgow creativity groups that aren't going to travel, get higher engagement levels more locally. So that might be worth considering. Of course, different groups are thinking about engagement differently, with greater or lesser inclination to engage. Many of the groups that the cultural sector has traditionally relied on are a little bit more on the cautious side in terms of future engagement. And again, that's maybe tipping us a little bit more towards thinking about family groups, thinking about some of the groups like Glasgow creativity. So that feels like maybe one of the places to look in terms of the longer term picture, all in the context that they're obviously very pinched by cost of living. So it's not necessarily a major new revenue stream, but as a way of kind of broad civic engagement and relevance and sort of catering to public. That does feel quite an important bit of the mix. So yes, I think that was the overall sort of shape or sort of story that we could see.